Well, hey there. Good afternoon, live from my basement. Welcome to our weekly live stream and podcast. I'm Patrick Finkston. I write the Illinoize.com. Coming up, we'll be joined by State Representative Jeff Keicher, a Republican from Sycamore, who's Republican conference chair in the House GOP leadership this new session. We'll discuss if there's any common ground we can find on gun violence, the new push to bring the graduated income tax before voters, and how the Republican Party can be relevant after they were wiped out in November. We'll also talk to Jon Seidel, the federal courts reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times, on challenges to the new assault weapons ban, more on that in a moment, as well as court challenges to the cash bail portion of the Safety Act and the criminal case against former House Speaker Michael Madigan. First, though, the assault weapons ban, which is continuing to permeate the news in this state. Much of your mainstream media is spending a lot of time on the gaggle of state lawsuits that are being filed by former Attorney General candidate Tom DeVore, former gubernatorial candidate Darren Bailey, and members of that so-called Eastern Bloc in the Illinois House. There was a downstate judge in Effingham County that put a temporary hold on the assault weapons ban, but remember that it only applies to the actual the plaintiffs in that actual case. So it doesn't apply to you or me or your local gun shop. And people smarter than me tell me either the state appellate court or the Supreme Court are going to boot that suit for lack of standing. The real question here on the constitutionality of this law is going to be settled in federal court. Two new suits were filed yesterday, in addition to the one filed last week by the State Rifle Association. So that's a total of three. These new ones from the NRA and a group of smaller kind of gun rights groups, including the group Gun Save Life, which you may recognize from the Burma Shave style signs they have up along interstates all around downstate. Their argument is essentially what you would expect. It's that the assault weapons ban is unconstitutional via the Second Amendment. Here's what we had this segment in the subscriber newsletter this morning. The way that they put the argument in the newsletter in their suit today that was filed yesterday. Contrary to the ignorant statements of those uninformed and or headline-seeking politicians who are opposed to civilian firearm ownership, the AR-15 and similar semi-automatic firearms are not weapons of war. The AR-15 is not used in war. No military has adopted it, opting instead for its automatic or burst fire capable counterparts like the M16 or M14. The same can be said for many semi-automatic rifles that are commonly owned by Americans today. Essentially, the argument that they're making is that the court in this latest big case called Bruen, Bruen, if you want to Google it, is that the court is saying that any traditional gun any traditional gun policy, any standard gun, maybe not some like 50 caliber over your shoulder bazooka sort of thing, but like anything that's standard in the gun closets or cases or cabinets around the state is essentially off limits from this sort of legislation. The question is, what is that definition? And I don't know that the Supreme Court's really weighed in on that at this point, and I'm sure they will. That's the whole point of this. Is this isn't going to be settled by a federal judge in Benton. This is going to probably find its way to the Supreme Court, and I wrote this in the newsletter the other day. It's disappointing that both sides are just talking past each other in this situation, in this instance. The left wants to indict every gun owner in the state as a a war criminal essentially, and every seemingly pro-gun person in the state wants to, shout, don't take my guns, pry them out of my cold dead hands, and you can't limit them from anybody. Well, in the end, the left should be talking about how to penalize those who are actually committing gun crimes, and the right should be penalizing those talking about how to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. And nobody's having that conversation on any sort of serious level at this point, and nobody's going to benefit from that. And then we're just going to continue to have people who are yelling at each other, and it's never going to make anything better. And that's frustrating. That's disappointing. So we'll see how these things shake out. Obviously, it's not going to happen overnight, but there are now 3 federal lawsuits filed in the Southern District of Illinois. So that's where the real discussion is going to begin. And I would advise you to pay attention to the federal court cases and less about the state court cases that are finding their way up and down the media these days because of some politicians who like to find some microphones. To be joined now by State Representative Jeff Keicher, a Republican from Sycamore up in the DeKalb neck of the woods. Representative Keicher, a member of Republican leadership, as the new General Assembly kicks off. Representative, let's dive right into issues.
Sure.
Because I think guns are the topic on everybody's mind right now with the assault weapon ban that was passed in the hours remaining in the General Assembly, then signed by the governor, and is already in court, and will surely find its way, before the U.S. Supreme Court by the time this thing is all said and done. I know you were a no vote. How do you respond to the folks like Bob Morgan, who I think is a really good guy with good intentions? How do you respond to them when they say we have to ban guns like this?
So one of my biggest frustrations, Patrick, and I've seen this in so many different facets that we've tried to pass in the state of Illinois since I've been in the General Assembly, is we're always playing to the lowest common denominator. We're always codifying law to get that one-off situation taken care of. And yes, we have tragedies across this country, but what I consistently see is that the solutions are not well thought out. They are inhibiting the use. The Second Amendment is a very, very plain spoken amendment. It's very clear on what it can do. I'm not a lawyer. I recognize that this decision out of New York that the Supreme Court rendered last year will modify things and what they can do. But at the heart of it, the dialogue and debate about what to do is two sides that are speaking past each other, because we certainly see my friends and neighbors who are law-abiding gun owners. They have their concealed carry permit. They have their FOID card. They are going out, they're hunting, they're target shooting. My granddad was a sharpshooter. We went out and shot trap, and he had a backyard target up at his home. And I have an undying respect for the use of a firearm, the safe control of a firearm, and also to a certain extent the enjoyment of shooting a firearm. It's certainly something that for many generations is core, not only to identity, but to their rights that have been codified in the Constitution. And when we see, I think there was a report over the last couple of weeks, we see in Cook County specifically, I think there was 20,000 guns, give or take, that were in the hands of those that shouldn't be. We see at the same time a hobbling of law enforcement to actually enforce not only the laws that are on the books, but getting firearms out of the hands of criminals and the mentally ill. And that just hasn't been done yet. So now we're taking with this scatter approach, and we're attempting to solve this grand problem by putting a Band-Aid on an issue that we haven't even stopped the bleeding on yet. And that needs to start at those core issues of going after the criminals who are holding them, going after the mentally ill, and hopefully for my Democratic peers, putting law enforcement back on the pedestal that they deserve to be on, because for far too long recently, we have not only put law enforcement at a disadvantage, but we have also societally force them to be lesser than a proactive force that they have been in the past. And they are fearful that they're going to be held to some higher standard that this governor will come up with at the last minute, and that the societal pressures out there will create for them. So we need to do better of speaking together instead of past each other. And we need to do better at identifying the issues that will actually help resolve the problem. And I go back to not impacting law-abiding gun owners and going after the criminals and the mentally ill to help make our areas, especially Cook County, a more habitable place when it comes to firearms and firearm safety.
I appreciate that you use the line about talking past each other, since that's exactly how I wrote it in the newsletter yesterday. But I think we also need to, whether you're, on the left, and, I've said this, the left needs to recognize that not all gun owners are bad, but it also seems the right is unwilling to have any sort of conversation about the fact that these mass shootings are happening. People are dying. Kids like this little punk in Highland Park who got an AR-15 when he shouldn't have, essentially.
Right. And again, goes to, had rules been enforced and held to a higher standard, we would have potentially not had the issue to the extent that we did.
But what can the right get behind in terms of keeping guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them? Because I think everybody can agree that not everybody should have a gun. So how do we keep those away from the bad people or the threats?
So I appreciate the question, but there's a corollary to that needs to go hand in hand, right? You're asking, what can the right get behind? And there are always going to be those on the very far right who are absolutely adherents to the pure language of the Second Amendment. Just like on the left, you're going to have these adherents.
To be fair, I'm not going to ask you what Democrats should do, because you're not a Democrat.
But on the far left, we also have that anything short of absolute banning of anything is not going to be satisfactory. So they are talking past each other. The vast majority of gun owners are responsible gun owners, and so the infringement upon their right to be in that space, I think it starts with criminality, and we are now making criminals by this new law that was passed. But I mean criminality and committing crimes. We go back, that 20,000 folks, that's low-hanging fruit. If we looked at taking 20,000 firearms off the streets of Chicago and Cook County by those that shouldn't have them, Patrick, how much less shooting would we have? And I think it also points out and highlights the misappropriation of this solving a Highland Park issue when we have South and West Side Chicagoans who have faced this danger for generations and still haven't seen the response despite many advocated solutions. And so we need to see that buy-in, and let's try something with what's currently there, I think, before we move that measure forward. Because otherwise it's just not fair. We're just giving lip service to it. And if we're going to infringe upon a constitutional right, we have to start with those that who arguably constitutionally shouldn't have it. And that's the criminals. That's the folks that maybe don't have the capacity to appreciate it and mentally ill. We need to start there. And we go back to the tragedy at my alma mater at Northern Illinois University, and nothing that we have addressed or passed except addressing mental illness would have resolved that situation prior to tragedy. So we need to look at that, and consistently it comes back to that. And yet my Democrat peers are so dismissive that we need to address those issues. And they continue. I'll go down a whole rabbit hole on that, but I'll pause there. I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate that, because I think it's obvious that, it is a left and right issue here, that the left seems to think in general, the left is in a position where it looks like they think all gun owners are bad.
Right.
Which I think anyone, in whether you're center left, center right, whatever, can agree that's not true. But it also, I've heard from far too many conservatives or pro-gun people who want zero restrictions on guns in any way, shape, fashion, or form. And to me, at least, as a guy on the center right, I look at that and just say that doesn't make sense, because there are people who were at a 4th of July parade, or at a school, or at a nightclub, or at a lunar eclipse thing in California this week. That,
Yeah.
I mean, these are people living their lives. So I don't know that there's compromise, but boy, shouldn't there be?
So let's go back to the premise that you shared, and that is talking past each other, right? So it is not a one size fits all solution. I've had folks that are gun owners that they'll tell you, yeah, you know what, little Jimmy over there, he should not be handling that. He does not have the capacity. And in my neck of the woods, in more rural Illinois, we definitely see where that you're taking care of that, and you're making sure that at a neighborly level, things are sought after, and that's almost a common sense thing out here. But in my more suburban areas, I have folks coming up to me saying two different narratives. They're suggesting that, you know, on the one hand, I don't see a need to have an AR styled automatic gun, but I don't mind that somebody else does if they're out target shooting or having fun with it or enjoying it recreationally. I don't want to take that away from them. And then I also have other folks that are coming up to me and they say, well, you know, I've been a Republican all my life, but I really think we need to do something. And the problem is, Patrick, is that something like this, something that is so core to our society, there is no single solution that needs to be implemented, because every single person along the spectrum is going to have a different feeling about what that ultimate solution needs to be. So why not start with the low-hanging fruit, recognize some successes, and move from there, because then the dialogue can gravitate. What we've seen is an imposition, right? And anytime you're forcing somebody to go along with something that at their core, they don't understand why we're doing this, and at their core, they don't recognize that this is a problem needing solved, which is largely rural Illinois, west of the collar counties and south of where we're at. You're forcing a third of the state of Illinois to not only react, but react aggressively, because they aren't solving the problem in Cook County and Chicago with the illegal gun ownership that's starting there. So let's not start by making more criminals through this act. Let's start by enforcing and taking away from criminals. Let's put resources behind law enforcement. Let's make sure that our ground level law enforcement has the tactical and safe manner to do that. And I know that my peers on the left are going to first say, so you're going to vote for the budget. And I tell you what, there are many things in that budget I would vote for. There are many things in that budget I wouldn't vote for. As soon as you put them all together, that creates a very iffy scenario. So if we start breaking down the budget by these line items that are specifically solving certain problems, you betcha we'll have Republicans on there, we'll have Democrats on there, because we are solving that unique issue. We aren't taking the baggage that traditionally, you know, Madigan's practice has been, let's throw it all in one bucket and pass it together so that we can get you on the good stuff and the bad stuff. We need to solve this problem. We need to be serious about it. We need to remove the gamesmanship that up to this point in time, all I've seen is that's the left that's played. We had
a story in the newsletter for subscribers this morning with Representative or Senator Rob Martwick. He's going to move toward bringing back the question of a graduated income tax.
Yeah.
Which you know, his assessment is that the way that we're moving now with his numbers he's getting from COGVA shows a $250 billion discrepancy between, you know, where spending today would go and where revenue would go by the time we get there. Obviously, voters rejected this in 2020. Where are you? How would you? Obviously, I think it's safe to say you're opposed to the idea, but
very safe.
What's your reaction to the thought of bringing the idea back up?
So let's break this down a little bit. I don't know if you had the opportunity to see my comments on the floor the other night as we were passing a supplemental appropriations bill, specifically actually to the violence interruption grants. And I read in front of former leader Harris before he left, I read through, I think it was 2.5 pages of granted organizations that were going to do this. And I asked Representative Harris, interrupt me when I get to an organization that does work in a Republican district. And I wasn't able to be interrupted because that hasn't happened. So what does that reflect? We go back a couple of years and we look at the significant capital funds, and this came up as a debate in the elections. We look at the significant capital funds that the Democrats have expended, and we look at the $2 billion in capital funds that went for pet projects in existing or newly drawn under the map Democratic districts. And we continue to see a government that panders to their way of thinking. We need to stop that. We need to have a governor who is about representing all of Illinois instead of the 2/3 that put him in office. 58%, I think was the margin, right? But for us in the House, we have 40 to their 78. We represent a third of the people of the state of Illinois. And for the governor to continue to cut out a third of the people of the state of Illinois, how dare you ask for additional dollars? You aren't even serving everybody in this state right now. And so we look not only at that, that's just a surface issue. But when we look at the expansive approach that he has taken to the spending protocol, at the same time, during the first year after it didn't pass, the state of Illinois took in the added revenues that his prior tax plan would have brought in, and we continued to spend. This current year was additional, I believe, hold me on the numbers if I'm inaccurate here, but it was an additional $2 billion, and now we're an additional $3 or $4 billion behind, in front of what our budget number was at the close of the budget planning that we did last spring. We continue to have growth in our dollars, and we continue to spend it. We haven't acted like adults. We haven't acted like fiduciaries in the eye of the Illinois taxpayer. So how dare we ask for more of that? We need to make sure that we hold the line until there is accountability. We cannot ask for more money than we already take. And that's my line. It is about ethics. It is about good governance. It is about holding accountable the actions that we're asking our government to do and not pandering and handing out thousands and millions of dollars to different groups that in the past have supported the governor and his side of the aisle.
To be fair, I don't think the governor, I think the governor said it's not something he's interested in when he was asked about it last week, but we'll see how that goes. Not interested in moving forward on a graduated income tax question. But again, it's January 25th, so we'll see what happens between now and the middle or end of May. Along those lines, though, in the governor's inaugural a couple of weeks ago, and it feels like this is kind of getting undercovered or underreported, it was kind of what the governor laid out as his priorities in terms of free college, free preschool, free childcare. You heard we had Comptroller Mendoza on last week, who said that the devil is in the details. And like if the free college follows along MAP grants, it's probably not that expensive. But if you open it up to like everybody who gets EITC, you're probably opening that up gigantically. Governor isn't saying how to pay for it or how much it's going to cost, but how do Republicans look at the idea of trying to give kids good starts, whether it's through preschool, whether it's working class families who need help with childcare, and as a father of a 14-month-old, it ain't cheap. Or obviously, trying to give kids a college education to keep them in Illinois. There are obviously good intentions here, but there's the question of how to pay for it.
So let me break that down a couple of ways. I don't know if you know much about my background. I was raised by a single mom who waited tables, Colonial Restaurant, to keep a roof over our head. And there were times that I can remember as a kid literally taking coins to put gas in the vehicle for her. We're pumping it to get exactly at $2 to go in the tank. Opening the cabinet doors and only seeing a jar of canned vegetables sitting on the counter. So my background and my experience has definitely been one of growth through adversity. And so that breaks down twofold. I think the state needs to do a much better job of taking care of our most vulnerable, and that is direct to the most vulnerable. It is not creating additional programs. It's not giving out additional dollars just because. It is taking care of those in need. I was very disappointed in the supplemental appropriation that we didn't look after our adult disabled population to the extent that they were asking, because that's going to mean things in our communities, and that's going to take resources that Illinois currently has because we're flush with capital, and it's denying our most vulnerable the opportunity to succeed in life by sending it and pandering it to different organizations. There were multiple chambers of commerce, not that they don't do good work, but I think if I was weighing whether to give money to a chamber of commerce or the disabled community, I would personally choose disabled community all day long. And so we look at the expansion of these programs, and of course, everybody wants what's free, right? Hey, we get it. We want to pay as little as possible. We are a sale culture. But I'm coming off of being the ranking Republican on higher education appropriations. And again, we look at my alma mater, Northern Illinois University. If you are a good grade student and you come from a household that makes under $75,000 a year, average household in the state of Illinois earns about $62,000 a year. So it's more than half of the households in Illinois. You won't pay a dime towards your tuition at Northern Illinois University. Through the granting process, through the Husky Promise is what they call it, and through getting the different aid packages assembled together, they have found a way through the Husky Pledge to make sure that those making under $75,000 get that free college as long as you maintain the grades. So I go back to qualifying and I go to means testing. Sue Shear had a bill spring before last that would have given free college to everyone that was pursuing a teaching certificate. And when asked whether this would apply to the daughter of the multimillionaire going to ISU, who daddy still had millions of dollars in the bank, would it apply to her? The answer was yes. It was over $1 billion program. There's no means testing to that. That person doesn't need the hand up to the extent that someone does whose mom is maybe making $30,000 a year, working in a restaurant, waiting tables 20, 25 hours a week to try to make sure her kids can get somewhere. So means test is part of what it is. Free college is a great narrative, but it just doesn't hold water. What if you get all D's? Are you still getting free college? What if your dad's a multimillionaire? Are you still getting free college? And I think that goes to daycare and preschool as well. In my community, like many others, there are not only the homeschooled population, but there are parents who intentionally make a decision that one of them will stay at home and care for their kids so that they can give their children a best opportunity by being there for them on a regular basis. And I think that this idea of free daycare and free preschool, again, it needs to be an opportunity for those that can't otherwise provide for it, but it also needs to be a means-tested opportunity that is optional. We should not be mandating people how they do how they work with their kids, because then we're indoctrinating them, and that's not right. That's also a step too far.
Representative, you mentioned the number of Republicans in the House in this new General Assembly is smaller than it's been, since the cutback amendment, which was essentially when I was born. I have to imagine, and I say this as a guy who worked on Senate staff when Republicans had 18 or 19 members, that it has to be really difficult to, one, get anything done, but two, stay relevant at all. So how do you say to your constituents, we can still get things done in Springfield other than just going down there and voting no on everything?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, to your last comment there, my constituents did not send me down there to say no. When I look back, the scariest vote that I took, Patrick, was on the 2019 Republican compromise to the budget that year that included the data center incentive, the franchise tax repeal, manufacturers purchase credit, Blue Collar Jobs Act, and a whole host of other Republican ideas that we were able to get passed in a very unique set of circumstances. And in my own district, that has led to the location of a Facebook data center. Ferrara Candy has built 2 facilities here. Amazon has built. We've got a couple other folks that are sniffing around. And what we need to do, we need to encourage that continued opportunity for job creators specifically who will come to Illinois and allow us the opportunity to give a good working career to those that come after us. And that's in the trade laborers, that's in the factories that are turning out amazing things in this new economy. So we need to present those opportunities, and we need to be available to them like we were in 2019, because nobody thought we could do it in 2019 either. So we need to look at where those opportunities lie. But along with that,
do you feel like you can trust the governor? I mean, after he went right back in and repealed the franchise tax?
I don't think that the governor has earned the right to be trusted without verification, like Reagan had suggested. But you need to start at a place. You can't just not govern, right? So, and I don't think he's done. When we look at DCFS, we look at DCO, we look at IDES, we look at some of the institutions that are administrative in nature in this state that have been unresponsive to our tax base, to our our constituents, we need to hold a greater accountability. And that's the other piece. I think we need to work on fiscal discipline and fiscal responsibility and pointing out where this spending plan has been mismatched and overdone, where we can do better at stopping the expansive state growth that we've seen over the last 4 years. But also on the ethics front, we need to be very, very diligent on making sure that we still continue to work towards closing these ethical loopholes. As someone who sits on the Legislative Ethics Committee, I have seen firsthand where, we're suggesting that there's an expansion in ethics while at the same time we're tying the hands of the organization that is charged with keeping legislators, my peers and I, accountable to that. And that just, it's not doing the good governance work that we should be doing, because once we do that good governance work, we restore the faith of the people of Illinois into what we do. And right now that is such a low level that we need to do everything we can to be good actors in good faith. And I would demand that not only of the governor, but also my peers on my side of the aisle and the other side. So our relevancy comes in creating the ideas. And I was most flattered last year to that point almost to have Senator Morrison steal my idea on the decennial review of taxing bodies. She swiped the language, re-put it in hers and sent it over, passed unanimously 3 times. So I guess that's a good thing. But flattered by the opportunity to present good bills and good ideas, no matter who gets credit for them, is needing to be where we can win.
Representative Jeff Keicher, appreciate the time, appreciate the conversation, and hopefully we'll see you around Springfield here over the next couple of months.
Thanks for what you do.
It's Representative Jeff Keicher joining us. Appreciate his time as he and I sat down to talk through a lot of issues. A few comments that came in as we were having that conversation. Let me pull this up. This would be from Todd Vanderbeide, who is one of the pro-gun advocates in the state. Over time, we've tried to work to keep guns out of the hands of bad guys. It gets turned around on us. And another responding to some of Representative Keicher's statistics, which I haven't taken the time to verify. So, here's this perspective. So off taking 20,000 weapons out of criminals' hands would stop killing is just bull. With so many guns within the nation, it won't take long for those 20,000 guns to be easily replaced in the criminals' hands. So a couple of perspectives there on some things that Representative Keicher had to say. Let's turn our attention to the court now, to federal courts, which seem to be tied inexplicably to Illinois politics these days, and maybe for a few more days than we would have liked. But between lawsuits and criminal cases, Jon Seidel from the Chicago Sun-Times, their great federal courts reporter, joins us. He is an expert on all these things that are in the news right now. And Jon, I really appreciate the time. Let's start with the gun ban and how this is going to wind up in court. Sure. Essentially, what I'm telling people is don't pay attention to the DeVore downstate state suits and pay attention to the federal suits, because this, to me at least, seems like it's going to be a federal constitutional question more than anything a state court can handle, right?
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Look, the divorce suits are already having some effect. There was a temporary restraining order issued against for several people late last week, and now he has a new lawsuit involving many more people. But you're right. I think long term, the ball game is really going to be in federal court, and whether or not the Illinois law comports with the Constitution. And as others have reported, including my colleagues, I think there's some serious question about whether or not this will stand up to scrutiny if it gets up to the Supreme Court. Whether it's the Illinois law or some other state's law, I think it's going to come down to interpretation by the Supreme Court.
How does the Bruen case, which is what the gun rights supporters are focused on, how does the Bruen case impact this law or really even in general potential gun legislation throughout the country?
Sure. So last year, the Bruin decision came down, and what it did was there used to be a two-part test that appellate courts would use well, I guess any courts, federal courts would use to analyze gun laws. It did away with the second part of the test, and really the guidance seems to be to look to the history and tradition of gun laws in the United States. And in fact, one part of that decision stood out to me. There was a comment along the lines of, if there's a societal issue that has continued to exist over this, going back to the 18th century in some form, if there was no gun regulation in place to deal with it, it's a pretty good indicator that any such law would be unconstitutional now. And one reason that stuck out to me is when I looked at the lawsuit filed by the Illinois State Rifle Association last week. Man, that lawsuit seemed to be written directly to the Bruin decision, and even talked about some of the more powerful weapons that were available in the 1700s. Again, seemed to be playing into this idea that we had powerful weapons back then. They weren't being regulated by these laws that we're seeing now. And if you follow that guidance from the decision, that would suggest that such a law is unconstitutional. Now, I think part of it may come down to whether these weapons are common and unusual or dangerous. I think there's probably an argument to be made that they are common. In fact, that's the argument that they're making in the lawsuit. It may come down to the dangerousness of these weapons, but it's an open question, and that's, I think, why we're going to have the litigation.
And you hear a lot about this weapons of war argument that gun control supporters are talking about, but I don't necessarily know that argument makes sense, because you've got, obviously, flintlock rifles were a weapon of war 100 years ago, but you still have bolt action rifles in the military today. The standard issue Army handgun these days is a 6-hour M17, which you can go purchase at the gun store today. And I wrote a piece in the newsletter yesterday about this, that it seems that these two sides are just talking past each other, that it's either, all guns are bad, or, all guns have to be preserved. That leads me back to this. How do we take these two sides that are so far apart and apply their positions to a question that was written in the 1780s, right after we had deposed a tyrannical king? I mean, how do you, how does a court balance those two issues?
I think it's a fantastic question, and I think what I've been
I don't know, and that's why I'm asking, because I don't see how, obviously it's a different era, but there's always a threat, from the perspective there is that you always have a threat of a tyrannical government, right? So I don't necessarily understand how you apply that to 2023 and beyond.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about how to answer that. Just a few random thoughts, and I don't know if this answers the question, but one thing that I've been thinking about is I've heard people on either side of this argument discuss this is, as a court guy, I just think about the legal issues, right? Yes, you can argue that guns are bad. The Second Amendment exists, and I don't think it's going anywhere in our lifetimes, and so if you want to put a law like this in place, you've got to acknowledge the legal framework that's out there. And the authors of this law have said that that's what they've done. I'm interested. I haven't heard more detail about exactly how they tried to address it, but I want to see how it holds up to this scrutiny. But no, you're right. I agree that I think people are talking past each other. I think on the one hand, you hear all guns are bad, and there's been, Highland Park, there's been terrible examples of gun violence. But we do have the Second Amendment in this country. It's there. It has to be acknowledged. It's there for a reason. And the judges, are not going to ignore that. If you're going to pass a gun ban, you have to acknowledge that the Second Amendment exists and it's there and it's going to be protected. So how that's analyzed through all that, I mean, this is exactly why we're going to have litigation probably over the next few years. And while we're going to have to hear from the Supreme Court about how they think to answer that question.
I wanted to touch on a couple of other issues with you, John, if you don't mind. The Safety Act. You and I were both in Kankakee in December when the Attorney General and some states' attorneys argued over the constitutionality of that state law, specifically the cash bail part of it. The question, it seems like the state Supreme Court is going to have to issue to work on, because this is, of course, going to wind up with the state Supreme Court, is over the idea of whether cash bail is specifically defined in the Constitution, because it's in the state Constitution. It talks about surety, which, sounds like cash for anybody who's a dope like me. But does that, and I know you've written about this, so where does this argument boil down to?
Well, it does boil down, I think, in part to that. And so you're right. Back last fall, I spoke to some experts about that line in the Illinois state constitution, including a state constitutional scholar who said that sureties do not have to be cash. It doesn't have to be money. Some people pointed to electronic monitoring. Some people pointed to monitoring by court personnel. So you don't have a bracelet on or an anklet on, but you have somebody that you have to check in with. It just depends on which end of the spectrum that you're on. But that line, it just says sureties. Now, there's also another part of the Constitution, though. I believe it's the crime victims' rights portion that refers, I believe, to the amount of bail. I might have the wording there wrong, but there is some other language within the Constitution that I think refers to the amount. And so the argument is that no, if you look at the combined language of the state constitution, it does refer to money. It does assume that money is going to be used as a surety. So yeah, that is going to be part of what we have to sort out. I do think that the Illinois Supreme Court has issued guidance in the past about sureties. And of course, the ruling out of Kankakee also dealt with the separation of powers. And, the Judge Cunnington, I believe, found that this was an undue infringement on a judge's right to be able to set bond. So I wonder how that separation of powers argument is going to come into play there as well.
Real quick, I wanted to talk about the criminal case against former Speaker Madigan as it continues. It just seems like the evidence continues to pile up as you see all these, the proffers come out in the ComEd situation. Again, from an outside perspective, this doesn't look good. And the feds usually don't take a case this high profile, don't make the charges unless they feel like they've got it. From your perspective, what are you hearing? What are you seeing in terms of where the former speaker stands?
Well, as far as where he stands, he's under indictment, and some people close to him, including his closest confidant, are about to go on trial. So Michael McLean, Ann Pramaggiore, the former CEO of ComEd, a former lobbyist, John Hooker, and then Jay Doherty from the City Club, they're about to go on trial in March. And it really will be a preview of the Madigan trial, because the McLean et al. Trial, if you will, is basically count two, I believe, of the Madigan indictment. So we're going to see a lot of evidence that could come out in the Madigan trial. The other thing that could be interesting is whether or not these defendants will reconsider their position once they're on the other side of this. And I don't want to assume anything here. They've all pleaded not guilty. They remain not guilty, unless a jury comes back and finds them guilty. But as you said, the federal prosecutors have a very good track record in this town. If they come out on the other side of this and some of these individuals are guilty, I'm not saying they're going to decide to cooperate, but it kind of changes the calculus a little bit. So there could be a squeeze there. So I think that's part of what's at stake.
What's the Madigan team saying? Whether it's, obviously publicly they're saying we're innocent and et cetera, but behind the scenes, how concerned are they?
Well, behind the scenes, I mean, first of all, I think they know about the track record in the federal prosecutor's office. I mean, that's no secret. They know what it means when, everything that you just said, that the U.S. Attorney's Office isn't going to bring a case unless they believe that they can prove it. But, that said, I think there is, from the beginning of this, there are questions about the line between politics in general and when it crosses the line into criminal activity. And I think that's going to be the theme through a lot of this, and whether or not trying to do things to curry favor with a powerful politician, whether or not that's illegal, because, let's face it, that kind of thing is done all over the country every day. People try to please powerful politicians, and that's part of what was going on here. But there are examples that prosecutors will point to of how it turned into fraudulent activity, violated ComEd's standards, the rules, the way they were supposed to conduct themselves, and it just turned into all-and-out bribery.
And John, before we let you go, and do appreciate the time, I think it all ties in to the case against Madigan. The U.S. Attorney John Lausch is leaving. He's obviously in the middle of this case, so. We don't know who's going to come in. Obviously, it's a Democratic administration, and you've got 2 Democratic U.S. senators, so that's the direction it'll be going. What does Lausch's departure mean? I think 1, in terms of the Madigan case, and 2, in terms of the crimes that are being prosecuted on a wider level in the Northern District.
Well, first of all, for the Madigan case, I really have no reason to think it's going to mean much. First of all, anybody who watches these things know that it's the U.S. attorney who's there at the press conference. That's the face the public sees. A lot of this work is done by the line prosecutors, the people who are actually at the table in the courtroom, as well as the FBI and IRS investigators, those people whose names and faces you don't see. They're the ones who are doing this work. It remains to be seen who the next U.S. attorney is. But don't forget that Tammy Duckworth and Dick Durbin went to bat to keep Lausch in his office. They said to conclude sensitive investigations. Everybody took that as a reference to the Madigan investigation. They wanted this seen through. And they're the same senators who are going to be involved in choosing the next U.S. attorney. So I don't see any indication that this is going to somehow throw the Madigan case off track. What does it mean for the wider spectrum of cases? I mean, the new U.S. attorney could come in with new priorities, but I think the priority here, again, Dick Durbin and Tammy Duckworth, the senators, are going to choose someone. Priorities in Chicago have always been public corruption. Street violence is another one. Those were priorities of John Lausch. Those were priorities of Zach Farden. And, one more thing I'd point out that I've seen now that I've been on this beat for about 8 years is there really, unless something drastic happens, there's been real continuity over the years. As much as Lausch gets credit and should get the credit, he was the guy in charge when a lot of these big public corruption cases were charged. Ed Burke, Madigan, that involved the cooperation of Danny Solis. The cooperation of Danny Solis began under Zach Farden. But again, I would point to that's because the line prosecutors, the agents, they have remained steady. And so as long as they're there doing that work, I would imagine it remains the same.
Jon Seidel, the terrific federal courts reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times. You've got a lot on your plate, my friend. Thanks so much for the time. I appreciate it.
Happy to do it. Take care.
All right. Thanks to Jon Seidel for taking time to join us on our live stream today. Like I've said, a lot on his plate between Guns and Safety Act and Madigan and all the other city of Chicago or Cook County politicians that are currently facing trials in federal court too. A couple of emails that have come in to mailbag@theillinoise.com. This from Cindy. Patrick, nobody needs an AR-15. All it does is kill people. And this one from Dave. The Second Amendment is cut and dry, and my right to own a firearm cannot be infringed. The Constitution trumps the gun grabbers in Springfield. So a couple of emails we've received in response to some of the things we've heard today. Let us know what's on your mind at mailbag@theillinoise.com. Thanks so much for taking time to sit down and listen to what we were hearing, what we had on people's minds. We're trying to have open discussions here, Republicans and Democrats alike. I'm always going to challenge people and push people and try and get them to give you a straight answer. And we're trying to have a broader discussion about policy in the state because Lord knows we need it. So thanks so much for taking the time to join us. We really do truly appreciate you, and hope you join us again next time. We'll have another live stream for you next Wednesday, and then we'll post this as a podcast too. And as always, drop us a note. Let us know what you think. We'll talk to you soon here on The Illinoise.